Hi, I'm Hannah, and this is Theology Therapist. Welcome. Today I wanted to talk to you about belonging, and belonging specifically in the context of moving and transitions.
I think that in life, we are often on the move or moving, right? Specifically in the last year, I think that has happened, and it's been particularly difficult during COVID to move somewhere new, which has continued because our lives have continued, and to find or create a sense of belonging. I first want to start with the process of leaving, right? So leaving, what we start with is a logistics, right? Keeping our head on straight. It's so easy in this process to get caught up in future worry and anticipatory anxiety, and really just kind of lose our minds in the future of where we're headed somewhere. And so even though we're not there yet, it's quite easy to already have sort of mentally left the place where you have been or where you are. There is, when we are moving, a never-ending to-do list, right? I remember when I left Boston, it was one thing after another, and it's the little things. It's the little things that are just kind of create that really long to-do. It's the little things that become overwhelming because they require, in a lot of ways, the same amount of attention from us. We get caught up in the little things. We also have it happen often that surprises or things happen unexpectedly, or we experience unexpected bumps in the road. So for a lot of this, it's the preparation around leaving is a huge source of stress and anxiety. And it's a big part of the process, really. It's the part of the process that we probably give the most time and attention to, or the most kind of thoughtfulness about, because in a lot of ways it requires the most out of us. So we think, right? Like I'll talk about soon how I do think that there are other parts of the process that do require a lot of attention we're maybe not accustomed to paying attention to, right? When we have such a long to-do list, when we're leaving, that can create overwhelm. We can end up becoming frozen, right? And just sort of feeling like we can't get anything done, or we can't, we don't even know where to start. I remember when I was packing up my studio in Boston, and I had friends come over and they said, "What do you want us to do?" And I just was like, "You tell me," because I have no idea. And so there can be that sense of being paralyzed and of not knowing even where to start. And when we feel that way, it can be easy to put off starting, right? Or to avoid either the sort of emotional sensations or the emotions that arise, or even the physical sort of acts of starting. On the positive side, we can also feel a sense of accomplishment, right? When we have tiny to-dos on our to-do list, they can be easier to check them off, right? If they're small, if they're really easy, it might be a little bit easier to check them off. And so I think research has shown for habits, right? Research about habits has shown that it's important to break down our goals, because when we're checking off something really small, it gets that burst of dopamine and we feel good about it, and then it encourages us to keep going. I would say that that's a flip side, that's a positive flip side of having a lot of small things on the to-do list, and one of the things that maybe can happen whenever we have such a long one, or whenever we are planning a big move. The other thing that can happen, I hear this all the time, is just forgetting or having this sense of having forgotten something, right? Like that sense, whether or not that did or didn't happen, that sense can kind of follow us. And just, I think, like for me at least, it really kind of creates this sort of background noise, this kind of like white noise of distraction, of like, I'm constantly like, what did I forget? And so there's a process of leaving, and there's a lot that goes along with logistics, right? Mentally, physically, emotionally. Logistics plays a heavy role on how we feel. And then the other thing is that we can have a lot of really mixed emotions about leaving. Some ones that I think come up often are grief, right? Feeling grief about whatever this transition is that's happening, or grief about leaving people or communities or etc. Right? Grief is a big one for moves and for just sort of like for those physical transitions. Another one is excitement, loss, gain. We can have fear, right? That there's that maybe that worry that we talked about a few minutes ago. We might be actually relieved or happy, right? So there's a whole host of emotions that often happen during those periods. And I would say that they often happen at the same time, right? It's not often that we have like one emotional state, where it might be more common where we feel a mixture. We feel a mixture of excitement and a sense of loss, or fear, right? Or we might feel grief and relief, and those two, they often go hand in hand and they're complicated. So the process of leaving requires a lot of logistics and it creates a lot of mixed emotions. The other thing is that I just wanted to point out how in history we have lots of examples of movement of these big transitions. So I'm thinking back to my religious historical texts. We have ascetic movements where somebody sort of commits to this lifestyle and they leave wherever it's often they leave, sort of wherever they are, wherever they're coming from, and they go to live in, I'll say the wilderness, but also like in sort of the middle of nowhere. They go to live out on their own. Ascetics are ones who are sort of denying like the physical body, right? They're denying the physical world. So there is this sort of transition there on maybe a smaller scale, kind of depending on the person. And it's less, I would say, it's sort of less of a thing now, I think, than it used to be. Then there's the Buddha. He grew up living or sequestered in his, we'll call it house, and wasn't confronted with any sort of life of hardships, or people who were experiencing those. And it wasn't until he was confronted with somebody who had been sick and someone who had died and 3 different life hardships that he ended up leaving home and family, right? And he went on his journey to sort of find his meaning, right, in life. And that's through his journey and process of understanding the world and enlightenment, and sort of how he has developed the Buddhist thought, right? What we know today is Buddhist philosophy. And then there are the Israelites. So the Israelites, they wandered in the desert for decades, and so they had to leave wherever sort of the original family was living, because they kind of came from this family, right? And then there are lots of different moments throughout their historical history, like ancient history, we'll say, where there are large movements there. So that original family, like I was talking about, there's a movement there after leaving Egypt. There's the decades of wandering through the desert. So we really have, not only through our religious historical texts, but all throughout history, we have examples of groups of people who are moving and experiencing these large transitions. So then we have the arriving. We've left wherever we have been, and we arrive, quite simply. Most oftentimes wherever we are landing, but it can also be more prolonged transitory periods, right, where you have multiple stops along the way, and so you arrive, but you're not at your final destination. But today we're just going to think about this arriving as the place where you're landing, right? So we have arriving, and there are a couple of things that happen. So really we have probably a lot of disorientation is what comes along with being in a new space, being in a space that you don't recognize, nobody recognizes you, you don't have any points of connection or sort of grounding anchors, right, into the community or the place or space. And so there is a lot of just sort of dust that gets kicked up once we've arrived somewhere, and there's a lot of disorientation that happens. One thing that I think can be really present during this period of arriving somewhere new is this idea of emotion permanence. So emotion permanence is sort of a parallel to object permanence, which child psychologist Jean Piaget determined that at this early age we learn that objects exist whenever we can't see them. So like a ball exists, even if it's not in the room with us, and that's something that we learn at an early age. And so that same principle applies to emotion. So emotion permanence would be understanding that an emotion exists even without the sort of stimuli that created it. And so I think we have we can have emotion permanence come up for us in an arrival sense, because we have, like I mentioned, that feeling of disorientation, others that come along with it. And I think it's easy to feel like we're always going to feel this way, right? So we have that stimuli of that catalyst of having moved, right? Being in this new space, or everywhere you go, right? There's something new and unknown, and in one sense that can be fun. That can be something that somebody actually really likes, or that can be something that causes a lot of anxiety. And regardless of which one that is, there's still this idea of emotion permanence, that this is going to always be this way. And even if it's something that somebody loves, they love that newness and they love finding something new, that isn't always going to exist, right? Because we are going to adapt, we're going to accommodate to the place, where the sort of new place where you have landed. I think that when the feelings are quite strong, especially when the negative feelings are quite strong, of maybe feeling alone, feeling unknown, right? There's nobody there that sort of knows you, right? Those can feel like they're going to be permanent emotions, right? Because that stimuli is there, it's currently sort of being activated. And so it feels like it has a sense that it's going to sort of always exist. And what's important to remember is that it's not, right? Like I was mentioning a second ago, that we get accustomed, that things wear off, that we get to know people. So we have this sense of emotion permanence in this way, and it's not something that lasts. Now, I would say that a defining thing about arriving is that most of the time it is a fixed point, right? Even if it doesn't happen immediately, it's a fixed point in time. It's a moment, it happens, it's done, right? We have arrived. And so the maybe strangeness of arrival is that it's a now and not yet. It's I am here and yet I'm not yet settled. I'm not a part of this community or this place, or I'm also still very connected to where I came from, where I just moved from. And so we have this fixed point in time where we are, where we're physically located, isn't often a good reflection of how we feel, how we see ourselves. It's not often a good reflection of even like how we understand our values or life, right? So because it's this fixed moment, I think it's important to remember that it is this fixed moment, and it is a sense of now and not yet. I have arrived and I'm not yet. I haven't yet left where I came from, or I'm mentally, emotionally, or I've arrived and I'm not yet a part of this new community. And then lastly, we have settling. So settling is that, and maybe what we think of when we think of arrivals, but settling is the phase that I would say, back to the beginning when I was saying that there's parts of this that we don't often give enough attention to or think enough about. That's the settling, right? So settling is where we reconstruct ourselves, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So settling is that more extended part of the arrival, right? It's where I think about, who am I here? Who am I now in this place? What is important to me in this moment, given various life transitions that have just happened? What do I want to be a part of, right? Maybe that's, for a lot of people, that's a gym, or like a type of exercise community, Some people that's a religious community, some people that's a volunteer community. For others, it might be coworkers, or it might be school, classmates. So what do I want to be a part of? And then there's the physical space, right? So the settling piece is settling into your physical space, which requires, I think we all know, right? That requires a lot of time and attention. It also requires an attention to, and a lot of times, an introspection, right? Into ourselves and what's important to us and how do we see ourselves, because I think we've all heard that our outer space is reflective of who we are inside. And then in the settling, we experience less anxiety and emotional upheaval, but not necessarily settledness or satisfaction, right? There's that now and not yet. You know, all that fear has likely started to calm down, but the positive aspects of whatever this transition is maybe caused by or is intended to create are likely not sort of rising. They're likely not kind of blossoming in this moment or to their full extent. But it's when we start to feel that we have our feet underneath us. So we start to feel like, okay, you know, oh, I found this coffee shop that I like. Okay, I've got most of the boxes unpacked. Oh, I've started my job. I like this. I go to this CrossFit gym. So settling. So far we have the leaving, we have arriving, we have settling. Now we have belonging. And I just want to spend a minute talking about belonging. Belonging happens when we have an identification of the self with the world around us, okay? So when we identify ourselves with who we see ourselves to be, right, our self-perception, and then so we have that self-identification of like, okay, I see myself being in the world and that feels like me. Then we identify ourselves in the world around us, in our community, right? Oh, I'm a part of this community. Or I heard somebody the other day say, when I worked at this synagogue for years, decades, and when I was leaving, I walked through the hallways and just thought, this place is me. It's so me, right? That's what I'm talking about. That's that looking around and feeling that, like that, identifying with the walls and the space, but not necessarily what books are on the shelf, but how the life that is created in that space, that's lived in that space. And then there is the physical, the identification of the self in the physical space around you. So in your living space, you've created it in a way that you love, in a way that makes you feel whatever way you want to feel when you come home. Those were often things that you had at the place where you left. So another thing that happens with belonging is that we create community ties. So community ties signify and can happen in different ways. And some of the ways are the things that I just mentioned. But the reason why they're so important for a sense of belonging is because, one, it creates a sense of community, which I would say most of us are looking for, right? In community, I would say we're all looking for, just to what degree, right? Some people want to have a community of hundreds, or some people are able to, you know, they're best friends with everybody. And others want to keep a really close-knit, tight group, right? So we're all looking for the same things. We're all looking for community, but that community looks different for everybody. So we want to have community ties because it creates a feeling of a strong connection to where we are and, you know, sort of who's in our world. Then when we have strong community ties, we oftentimes feel meaning and purpose. So being connected to our community gives us a sense of purpose in the world and that there is meaning to what we're doing or how we're living. And if those don't develop, so if community ties don't develop after we've lived or settled somewhere, we may struggle to feel at home, settled, or connected to a community. And it can create this maybe sense of loneliness, right? So we'll take a little bit of a closer look at loneliness next week, its safeguards, its pitfalls, and a little bit more about
why it's so important. I hope this was illuminating, that you were able to find some identification in this video about maybe your movement, your process, your transition period. And there are often things that we all experience at different times. So if you are going through a transition period, where did you find yourself in this process? Where are you in this process? Are any of these things, have they been a struggle? And know that, like I said before, that there is a now and not yet. That there is object permanence or emotion permanence that comes up. And so if the things that you're feeling right now are really overwhelming, they're going to pass as you start to settle and create a sense of belonging. I'm glad to have you here. It was good to see you. Remember, you can like, subscribe, comment, share this video if you found it to be helpful. I look forward to talking to you again next week.